The dining room of the Brass Anchor was full of the usual Friday night noise. The clinking of heavy silverware against thick porcelain plates, the low hum of conversation, and the constant, rhythmic squeak of rubber-soled shoes against polished oak floors. To anyone sitting at a table near the window, enjoying a medium-rare ribeye and a glass of Cabernet, it looked like a well-oiled machine. But behind the swinging double doors that separated the dining area from the kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of burnt garlic, old grease, and pure, suffocating stress. My name is Arthur Pendleton, though for the last 3 days, everyone in that building knew me only as Artie, the new, slow-moving dishwasher who couldn't seem to get the pre-rinse sprayer to work without splashing himself in the chest. I was 58 years old, my back throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and my hands were raw from cheap lemon-scented detergent. What no one in that kitchen knew, not even the general manager who had hired me on the spot during a desperate Tuesday afternoon walk-in, was that I owned the entire restaurant chain. The Brass Anchor wasn't just another asset on a spreadsheet to me. It was the very first restaurant I had opened 30 years ago with my late wife, Clara. We had built it from a run-down diner into a regional legend. But over the last 5 years, as the business expanded into a 40-location franchise, the soul had been slowly drained out of it. Customer reviews were plummeting, employee turnover was through the roof, and rumors of severe staff mistreatment had finally reached my desk at corporate headquarters. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes, without a security guard or a public relations representative smoothing out the edges. So, I was standing at the stainless steel sink, wiping down a greasy stack of sauté pans, when the kitchen doors burst open with a loud slam that echoed. "Where is it?" a voice roared. It belonged to Marcus, the general manager. Marcus was a tall, sharp-featured man in his late 30s, who always wore suits that looked just a little too expensive for a restaurant manager's salary. He stepped into the prep area, his face flushed red, his jaw tight with anger. "Who served table 14? A young waitress named Sarah froze near the bread station, a tray of ice waters balanced trembling in her left hand. She was barely 21, working 60 hours a week to pay for her younger brother's insulin and her own college tuition. I had spent the previous evening watching her stay an hour past her shift just to sweep the floors, so the night crew wouldn't get docked on their bonuses. "I did, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there something wrong with the steak?" Marcus walked right up to her, invading her personal space until she was forced to step back against the metal prep table. "Wrong? The customer said it was undercooked. Do you know what that costs us, Sarah?" "Marcus, please," Sarah pleaded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The ticket said medium rare. I brought out exactly what the line cooked. I can ask the kitchen to fire another one right now." "You're not firing anything," Marcus snapped, snatching the tray from her hands so violently that water sloshed over the edge, soaking her apron. "You're paying for it out of your tips tonight. Every single cent." I stopped scrubbing. That wasn't just against company policy, it was illegal. When I wrote the employee handbook 2 decades ago, I specifically inserted a clause protecting staff from paying for kitchen errors or dissatisfied customers out of their own pockets. I set down the scrub brush, wiped my wet hands on my apron. "Excuse me, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice as calm and unthreatening as possible. "I couldn't help but overhear. Company policy states that remakes are absorbed by the house overhead, not taken from server tips." Marcus turned his head slowly, looking at me as if a pile of dirty rags had suddenly spoken. A cruel, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "What did you just say to me, dish boy?" "I'm just saying," I continued softly, holding his gaze, "that taking her tips isn't right. It's not how this place is supposed to be run." The kitchen went dead silent. The line cook stopped flipping burgers. The prep crew paused their knives. Nobody spoke to Marcus like that. For 3 months, he had ruled this restaurant through fear, intimidation, and quiet financial cruelty. Marcus took 3 deliberate steps until he was standing inches from my face. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore, mixed with the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke. "You've been here 3 days, Artie," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't know how anything works here. You're an old, washed-up loser who couldn't even manage to land a job better than scraping half-eaten garbage off plates. You don't tell me what the policy is. I am the law in this restaurant. You're the manager," I corrected him gently, "not the owner." That was the spark that set off the powder keg. Marcus's eyes went wide with pure rage. Before anyone in the room could react, his right hand flew back and cracked across my left cheek. The sound was like a whip cracking in the enclosed space. The force of the strike sent me stumbling backward into the steel sink, my knees knocking against the lower frame. My head throbbed, and the sharp taste of copper filled my mouth where my inner lip had cut against my teeth. The kitchen collectively gasped. Sarah let out a small scream, covering her mouth with both hands. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily, flexing his fingers. "That's for talking back," he sneered, looking down at me as I steadied myself against the edge of the sink. "Now pick up those pans, wash them, and if I hear another word out of your pathetic mouth, you'll be out on the street without a paycheck." He turned on his heel and pushed through the double doors, letting them swing wildly behind him. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the drip of the faucet and the hum of the exhaust hood. Sarah rushed to my side, her face pale, reaching out to support my arm. "Artie! Oh my God, Artie, are you okay? I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "It's not your fault, Sarah," I said quietly, using a clean towel to dab at the blood on my lip. My hand wasn't shaking from fear. It was shaking from a deep, cold fury that I hadn't felt in 30 years. I looked around the room. The head cook, David, a man in his 50s, who had worked for the company for 4 years, was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The assistant manager, a quiet woman named Elena, was staring at the door with a mixture of terror and disgust. Not a single person had stepped in, not because they were bad people, but because they were completely broken. They were terrified of losing their livelihoods, terrified of Marcus, and completely convinced that no one in the world cared about what happened to them inside these 4 walls. They believed that corporate didn't care. They believed the owner was just some wealthy shadow in a high-rise building who only looked at profit margins. They were half right. Up until 3 days ago, I had been sitting in that high-rise building, looking at spreadsheets, completely ignorant of the nightmare my original dream had turned into. I took off my yellow rubber gloves and dropped them into the sink. I untied my grease-stained apron and let it fall to the floor. "Artie, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with panic. "If you walk out now, he won't pay you for the week. He does that to everyone who quits." "I'm not quitting, Sarah," I said gently, looking her straight in the eyes. "And you don't need to be afraid anymore. None of you do." I walked past the shock-line cooks, past the prep tables, and through the rear exit into the cool night air of the alleyway. Standing by the dumpster, I pulled a small, sleek black smartphone out of my pocket, a phone I had kept hidden in my locker for 3 days. I dialed a short code speed dial. It rang once. "Arthur?" The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, and alert. It was Victoria Vance, my head of corporate operations and chief legal counsel. "Is everything okay? You weren't supposed to check in until Sunday." "Victoria," I said, my voice completely steady, though my cheek was still burning. "I need you to pull up the master employee roster for store number 1. I need every regional supervisor, the head of HR, and 2 payroll auditors in the parking lot of this building in 5 minutes. There was a brief pause on the line. Arthur, what happened? I just found out how my business is being run, I replied. And 5 minutes from now, this restaurant is undergoing a complete management restructuring. I hung up the phone and stood in the alley for a moment, breathing in the crisp evening air. My mind rushed back to 30 years ago, to the night Clara and I laid the tile in this very alleyway ourselves. We had painted the walls, designed the menu, and promised each other that our restaurant would be a place where people felt welcomed, safe, and valued, both in front of the house and in the back. Somehow, along the road to success, I had lost sight of the floor beneath my feet. I had trusted managers based on numbers, on bottom lines, on cost-cutting metrics that looked fantastic on paper, while 5 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled quietly into the rear alleyway. Victoria stepped out of the lead vehicle, holding a thick leather binder, followed by 3 corporate executives in formal business attire. Victoria took one look at my face, the red swell on my left cheek and the cut on my lip, and her eyes narrowed into sharp steel. Arthur, she said softly, who did that to you? The man running my store, I said simply. Follow me. I didn't enter through the back door this time. I walked around to the front entrance, pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and stepped into the main dining room. The room was packed. Soft jazz played over the speakers, couples were laughing over wine, and Marcus was standing near the host stand, wearing a fake, practiced smile as he greeted a party of 4. When Marcus saw me walk through the front door, his smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of utter disbelief and rage. He marched directly toward me, ignoring the patrons, who turned to look at him. Are you insane? Marcus barked under his breath, grabbing my shoulder to drag me toward the foyer. You don't walk through the front of the house looking like a homeless person. Get out before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I didn't move an inch. I didn't flinch. I slowly reached up, took his hand off my shoulder, and squeezed his wrist until his eyes widened in shock. You're not calling anyone, Marcus, I said, my voice echoing across the quieted dining room. Behind me, the front doors pushed open again. Victoria Vance and the team of corporate executives walked into the lobby, their polished presence instantly shifting the air in the room. Marcus's face drained of color as he recognized Victoria from the annual company conference slides. MS. Ms. Vance? Marcus stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling in an instant. What are you doing here? We weren't expecting a corporate audit tonight. Victoria didn't answer him. She walked up to me, opened her leather binder, and handed me a small, gold-trimmed pen and a sleek silver lapel pin, the original anchor emblem that only the founder of the company wore. I pinned the anchor to the lapel of my worn flannel shirt. Then I turned back to Marcus, whose mouth was hanging slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between my face, the pin, and the corporate team standing behind me. You told me 5 minutes ago that I was a washed-up loser who didn't know how this place worked, I said calmly, looking him dead in the eye. You told me that you were the law in this restaurant. Marcus took a step back, his hands beginning to tremble visible. Artie, I don't understand. My name isn't Artie, I said, my voice resonating through the now completely silent restaurant. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I built this restaurant with my wife 30 years ago. I am the owner of this company. A collective murmur went through the dining room. Several patrons set their forks down. But the real shift happened behind the swinging doors. The kitchen crew, hearing the commotion in the lobby, had pushed the doors open a crack. Sarah, David, Elena, and the entire kitchen staff were standing there, watching the scene unfold in absolute shock. Marcus looked at the corporate executives, looking for a lifeline, but Victoria's face was made of granite. "Arthur," she asked, "how would you like to proceed?" I took a deep breath, looking around the room at the polished tables, the glowing light fixtures, and finally at the terrified, exhausted faces of the staff peeking through the kitchen doors. "Exactly 5 minutes ago," I said, speaking loud enough for every single person in the room to hear, "I watched the management of this restaurant assault an employee, steal tips from hard-working servers, and govern through fear and abuse. That ends tonight." I turned my head toward the kitchen doors. "Sarah, David, Elena, everyone, please come out here." Slowly, hesitatingly, the entire back of house and front of house staff filed into the dining room. They stood in a group near the host's stand, confused, scared, and unsure of what was happening. I looked directly at Marcus, then at the assistant manager who had stood by and enabled his behavior out of fear, and finally at the shift leads who had participated in the toxic culture. "Effective immediately," I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. "The entire management staff of this location is fired." Marcus gasped. "You can't fire me. Look at the sales figures this quarter. I brought food costs down by 15%. I streamlined labor. You cut food costs by serving substandard ingredients, and you streamline labor by stealing from your workers and working them to the point of collapse," I replied coldly. "You didn't build this business, Marcus. You parasitized it. Pack your things. Security will escort you off the premises in 2 minutes." Marcus stood frozen for a second, then realization settled in. His career in the industry was over. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, followed closely by the upper management team, escorted by the corporate security guards who had stepped inside. The dining room was dead silent. The patrons were staring. The remaining staff, the cooks, the dishwashers, the servers, the busboys, stood together in a cluster, looking utterly bewildered. They had just watched their tyrannical boss get fired on the spot by a man they thought was a slow, quiet dishwasher. I stepped toward the remaining staff. The cold anger in my voice melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of warmth and deep gratitude. "I spent the last 3 days working alongside all of you," I said softly, addressing the staff directly. "I watched Sarah work 60 hours a week with a smile on her face, caring for her family. I watched David cook every meal with pride, even when he was given subpar ingredients. I watched this team support each other in a toxic environment that I allowed to exist because I stopped paying attention." I walked over to Sarah and gently took her hands. "Sarah, you are no longer a server here. Starting tomorrow, if you accept the position, you are the new assistant general manager of this restaurant, with a full corporate scholarship to finish your degree." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, and she covered her mouth, unable to speak. I turned to David, the cook. "David, you know this kitchen better than anyone. You're the new head executive chef of this location. Your first task tomorrow morning is to throw out every cheap ingredient in the walk-in cooler and reorder the premium cuts we used to serve." David let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, a slow smile breaking across his face as he nodded firmly. "And as for the rest of you," I said, looking around at every single face, the busboys, the dishwashers, the line cooks, "every single employee remaining in this building is receiving an immediate 20% wage increase, effective starting the hour you clocked in today. Furthermore, corporate will be establishing an emergency relief fund for any employee facing medical or personal hardships." The silence in the dining room broke. A sudden, thunderous round of applause erupted, not just from the staff, who were hugging each other and crying, but from the patrons at the tables. The customers stood up, clapping and cheering, moved by the sight of real, uncompromising justice taking place right in front of him. I looked around the room, feeling a heavy weight lift off my chest for the first time in years. The black eye on my cheek was throbbing, and my body was exhausted, but as I looked at the tears of joy on Sarah's face and the renewed pride in David's eyes, I realized something fundamental. A business is not a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet. It is not a series of profit margins, labor percentages, or quarterly goals. A business is nothing more than the human beings who dedicate their lives to running it. When you lose sight of the people at the bottom, you lose the very foundation of everything you built. Never forget that the true strength of any leadership isn't measured by how many people bow to your authority, but by how many people you lift up along the way.